Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Jay Overholser, and this is my digital poster presentation about engaging in critical trans fandom research. So first, I want to briefly give you a bit of background information regarding my current research to give you a bit of context behind how I started having a lot of these conversations that I'm going to be talking about in this digital poster. And so my current research as a doctoral candidate is looking at how trans, non-binary, and other genderqueer/gender questioning individuals use their engagement with online queer fan works in their exploration and development of gender, both their own gender and how they understand gender much more broadly. Now, I won't go into too much more detail about my specific project here, as you don't really need to know a ton about it to understand this poster, but at the core of it, my research really focuses on exploring trans experiences and understandings from a distinctly trans perspective. And what we need to keep in mind when engaging in research like this is that the foundations and traditions of contemporary research come from research institutions created through and by very normative perspectives, i.e. that of cisgender, straight, white, able-bodied men. And these research institutions have long histories of being exclusionary and really only considering certain kinds of perspectives. And so oftentimes when you are trying to do research with and about perspectives and experiences that are outside of that very normative position, you start to run into lots of barriers, things that traditional research and traditional research structures fundamentally are not meant to account for. And so when I was designing my research, I really had to consider what it meant to design and conduct research from a trans perspective, and really what it means to develop a research framework specific to critical and intersectional trans research practices. And central to both these questions, I found myself coming back to the same question over and over again. That is, how do I actually do such research in a way that is both ethical and compassionate? And one of the things that I find fairly consistent across different critical and intersectional research practices is that they often stem from perspectives and approaches that already exist outside of research. For example, a lot of Black feminist thought originates from Black feminist work, and a lot of queer research originated from queer activists. And so following the same tradition, I really wanted to consider what my personal ethics are, i.e. like what are my personal moral guidelines that I hold when it comes to interacting with other people in community, in spaces outside of research, in activism, and all these other kinds of spaces. And really what moral ethical lessons have I learned from these spaces and communities? And so for me, considering what it means to develop critical intersectional trans research practices meant looking at the moral guidelines that I follow in my day-to-day life and considering how they could be applied to my research to account for some of those alternative perspectives and needs that traditional research and ethical guidelines might not consider. But I also acknowledge that even though I'm trans and non-binary, I am working with lots of other trans, non-binary, and other genderqueer people who are coming from all different walks of life. And so it is still very easy for me to perpetuate and enact harm on my participants in my role as researcher. And so this conversation around critical ethical research for me constantly returns to the role of compassion and the role of care as key to what makes my research practices actually ethical. And so for me, ethical research is compassionate research because it is research that keeps in mind the humanity of our participants, the humanity of the researchers, and it keeps in mind the end goal of why we are conducting this research, i.e. why are we engaging with these people? Why are we collecting this information? This kind of research really tries to stay grounded in the question of what good does this serve? And that is not to say that knowledge for the sake of knowledge is not worthy, but especially when you're coming from this position of power as a researcher, compassion is so important. And I say this because it is so easy to come into research from the perspective of being the most knowledgeable on a topic, of being the more educated person, oftentimes compared to your participants, which can really easily tip into a sense of superiority or authority. So compassion, to me at least, calls to mind less of a hierarchical relationship, and it fundamentally harkens back to the fact that at every step of the research process, we really need to be thinking about who are the people that we will or will be interacting with, how will they perceive what you're doing, how will they think about what you're writing, and how will they think about how you're interpreting their words, their knowledge, their experiences, so on and so forth. And so you might be wondering, that's great and all, but practically speaking, what does this actually look like? And so I want to offer an example from my research. This is just one example, but I think it really highlights some of these thought processes that I've discussed so far. And the example that I'm bringing to the table deals with compensating participants. As a grad student, I don't have the funds to pay my participants, but the idea of benefiting from my participants' knowledge, their experiences, time, and labor without compensating them in some way was something that I fundamentally could not reconcile with. And so I really had to consider what I could do to try to resolve this dilemma where this was just not matching up with my moral code. And this is one of the places where I turn to the communities that I engage with outside of research and consider how I engage with these communities and how that could be applied to my research practices. And so one of the things that I remembered is that in fandom and fan spaces, interactions are very rarely built around exchanging money for goods and services. A, because it is often illegal or legally questionable, such as in the case of fan fiction, because of copyright material, but also because as fans, we're really engaging in these spaces and communities because of our love and obsession with our object of fanish devotion. Instead, what you might see more often in fan communities is lots of circular gift giving. For example, if someone posts a story that you really love, that's so beautiful and that moves you, and you're an artistic person, you might draw a piece of fan art from about one of the scenes from the story, post it and tag the writer. Or you might comment on the story, how much you enjoyed it, what your favorite parts were, how it made you feel, and really just offer praise to the writer. And these are just some of the different things that people do. Not even to like repay the author, but to show their appreciation for what this other person's brought to this space in whatever way they have the ability to. And so I tried to consider how we could bring this into research space. And I came across this idea of compensation in kind, which is for me about acknowledging the labor and the time and knowledge that my participants are bringing to this research and offering them the compensation or the option of compensation in some way. Saying, I say that if the contentment, the happiness of just contributing to the research is enough, that's fine. But if you would like something else, here are some possible options. In my research, this might look like me offering to proofread one of my participants' fanfics, or if they're a student in a course that I'm knowledgeable about, I could offer an hour or two of my time tutoring, basically really discussing with each participant what would be the most helpful or be a fair exchange in their mind. And at its heart, this entire thing is about showing your appreciation and that you genuinely value the work and knowledge that they bring to your own research. And while this example might be more specific to my research project, I think the thought process behind this example can be applied to lots of different kinds of research because at its heart, research ethics should be about care. It should be about keeping in mind the humanity of who you are working with, about keeping in mind your humanity and keeping in mind why you are actually doing all of this. Thank you, and that is all I have to talk about.